By 1952, so many patients had relived details of their prenatal period that I no longer regarded it as anything remarkable. So when a patient who had been in therapy for several weeks told me that she was sure that the cause of her illness lay in something which had happened before she was born, I replied that I could help her to find out what it was, not anticipating that anything out of the ordinary would come to light. The patient was a young married woman in her mid-20s. Her principal complaint was a depression from which she had been suffering for 2 years before she came into the hospital. She had already revealed that one of her worst problems was a horror of anything to do with sex. Although she had 2 children, she had always been terrified of intercourse and even had to leave a room if the conversation turned on sexual matters. She was an excellent hypnotic subject, and her fear of sex seemed a promising line along which to cause her to regress. She soon found herself back at the moment when she had just been born and was choking from something wound tightly around her neck. She had no idea what this could be, and I asked her to trace it. Her hand went first to her neck, and then, as though running something between her finger and her thumb, it wandered down to her navel. "It comes from my tummy," she said. A few moments later, she exclaimed, "A man is injecting something into my arm." She felt exceedingly frightened and was quite sure that both the constriction around her neck and the injection were attempts on the part of her mother to get rid of her. When I had brought her out of hypnosis, she told me that even the idea of an injection had always filled her with acute alarm. It occurred to me that, in a symbolic sense, sexual intercourse fitted easily into this pattern. At the next session, she declared that she would never get better until she discovered the origin of her feeling that her mother had not wanted her. Under hypnosis, she affirmed that this had originated before she was born. This time, therefore, I regressed her straight back to the intrauterine state. I regressed her straight back into the intrauterine state. At once she appeared to be in great distress, moaning, "I'm burning, I'm burning." I asked her where she felt the pain. She replied quite definitely that it was in her stomach. I told her that she could see something which would tell her how long she had been inside her mother. She saw first the word 7. Then, in answer to my question, 7 what? She saw the word months. She declared she was quite certain that the burning was caused by something which her mother was doing to her, trying to get rid of her. I then told her if she had ever felt a, I told her that if she had ever felt a similar sensation before, she would go back to it. I counted slowly to 10, and again she moaned, "I'm burning, I'm burning." This time she was equally definite that the pain was in her head. I asked her how big she was. In a very faint voice, she replied, "Very tiny. I cannot move my arms or my legs." Again, I asked her to see something which would tell us how long she had been in the womb. She saw the word 6, but this time, in response to my question, added the word weeks. Again, she was certain that the burning was due to something that her mother was doing in an attempt to get rid of her. At this point, I told her that she would progress to the time of leaving her mother. As I was counting, she suddenly appeared to be very worried. I asked her what was wrong, and she replied that she felt that there was something around her neck. She was able to pinpoint her intrauterine age at 5 months. As I reached 10, she became very distressed indeed. She felt she was in a tunnel from which definite frantic efforts. She was quite unable to escape. Then she felt someone get hold of her legs and pull them out. Next, something hard and painful grasped her head and began to twist it. And then she was lying on something white, and she felt that she was choking from something around her neck. She was aware of a man and a woman both dressed in white, and someone shrieking, "I don't want her! I don't want her!" At this point, I progressed her to the present day and brought her out of hypnosis. She recalled all that she'd been through and insisted that it was as real to her as the memory of her breakfast. She knew very well what she had experienced, but she still had no idea what it was that had been around her neck. And at the end of the session, she looked and felt tired out. To anticipate a little, this patient's mother, after the end of the treatment, confirmed that her daughter had been born as a breech, and also that she had been nearly asphyxiated by the cord, which was wound tightly around her neck. When the patient arrived for her next session, she greeted me with, "Do you know, doctor, I feel somehow that it was my fault that my mother did not want me, but I must find out what it was that I did wrong." I hypnotized her again and began by putting to her once more the question, "Did this happen before or after you were born?" The answer was as positive as ever, before. We had already been as far back as the 6th week of her prenatal life, and already, even at that early stage, she was quite certain that her mother did not want her. So I asked her in a tone which I made as calm and level as I could, "Can you tell me whether this thing that you did wrong occurred before you started to grow inside your mother or after? Was it after or before?" Her reply was immediate and again very positive. "Before." I asked her then, "Is it possible for you to recover this event?" "Yes." "How can I help you to recover it?" "By counting to 100. So I counted quietly to 100 and asked her what she could tell me about herself. In a barely audible whisper, she said, "I'm a tiny spot." She could tell me no more about herself than that, except that she was in a very small place. Then she suddenly announced that she had moved into a larger place, and she knew she had to touch something, but it kept moving away. I sat waiting. Suddenly, she clasped her head, gasped with pain, and exclaimed, "I've touched it, and now I know what it was that I did wrong. I should never have touched the thing that was moving." She repeated this phrase over and over again. "I should never have touched the thing that was moving." After some minutes, I interrupted and I told her that I was going to bring her back to the present day, that I would count slowly from 100 down to 1, and that she would come forward in time to the present moment. From time to time, I paused to ask her what was happening. Immediately, I started to count. She began to grow bigger, though for a while she still remained just a spot. Then she experienced once more the burning, which had occurred at 6 weeks. At 5 months, she again became aware that something was around her neck. I caused her to leapfrog over the experience of birth, and she found herself on the white sheet with the man and woman in white. From that point, I brought her forward fairly rapidly and out of hypnosis. She awoke utterly exhausted and looked completely bewildered. She said, "I know all that was real, but would you kindly tell me what it meant?" I had no doubt that she had been reliving her conception and her subsequent intrauterine life. But I was reluctant to tell her this, and for the next half hour or more, I tried to lead her to realize this for herself by asking appropriate questions. At this stage, a most unexpected fact came to light. I was well aware that this patient had had only a very limited formal education, which probably did not include any teaching in biology, but I was not prepared for her complete ignorance of the biological facts of life. She was able to tell me that if you wanted a female rabbit to have young, you would have to get a male rabbit too. But she had only the haziest idea of the role that each played in reproduction. She appeared to be completely ignorant of such things as spermatozoa and ova. Despite the fact that she had borne 2 children, she had no idea of the significance of the umbilical cord. To her, the navel was something that happens when you were born. This patient was of good average intelligence. I do not think that a wish to deceive me was a content of any part of her, conscious or unconscious. It is possible that when younger she had known all these things, but for some psychological reason had subsequently repressed the knowledge. But I do not think this is the case. I believe the explanation is that her fear of sex had been present from the very start of her life and had had the effect of stifling all curiosity about anything connected with it. As she was under an anesthetic when both her children were born, it's very probable that she had never seen an umbilical cord. It is just conceivable, though I did not ask her about this, that she never saw either of her children naked until the stump of the cord had fallen off, in which case she would have remained ignorant of the significance of the cord. Be that as it may, the most leading of questions failed to bring her near any understanding, and eventually I offered to tell her what I believed she had been reliving. Up to this time, she had changed little from her condition prior to the start of her treatment. She had seldom appeared severely depressed, but was completely listless. She would always do anything she was asked, but never showed any interest or enthusiasm for what she was doing. She seldom smiled, and her expression was always rather wooden. But as I began to tell her about the physiology of conception, a look of enlightenment started to dawn on her face, which was profoundly moving. She had not the slightest doubt that her experience as a tiny spot was a reliving of her period before conception, and that touching the thing that was moving was the moment of conception itself. She exclaimed, "Now I understand what it was I did wrong. I was never meant to be born. That explains why I've never felt that there was a place for me in the world." She paused for a moment, looking thoughtful, and then, with a truly joyous note, she went on. "But what does it matter that my mother never loved me? My husband does, and so do my children. I have all the love any woman could want." On that note, we ended the session. It had started at 8 in the evening, and now it was close on to midnight. Next morning, she was still in bed. Understandably, she looked limp, very limp, but she was also radiantly happy. following morning with a glint in her eye, of which I would never have thought her capable. She said, I want my husband. He was in a different part of the country and could not reach her till the next day when they went off together. She called in to me to see me. She called in to see me a week later. After 8 years of marriage and 2 children, they had been having their first real honeymoon, and she looked a different woman. Some weeks later, she wrote to tell me that she had just had several teeth out under local anesthetic, and the injection had not worried her in the least. Shortly after the patient had left the hospital, her mother came to see me. As I have already recounted, she confirmed most of the details of the patient's birth as the patient had relived them. She denied ever trying to get rid of her child, but went on to tell me something which interested me far more than would any admission of an attempt at abortion. Her husband's mother had been fanatically jealous of her, even before her marriage, and had threatened her with physical violence if she ever became pregnant. Though her pregnancy had been a period of chronic fear, punctuated by more than one moment of panic when her mother in law had had to be physically restrained from trying to carry out her threat. It seemed to me entirely possible that the pain which the patient had felt when she touched the thing that was moving was in some obscure way related to the mother's dread of becoming pregnant. I feel sure that the episodes of burning that she had relived so vividly were the efforts upon the unborn child at the moment of acute fear experienced by her mother. A physiological explanation of this might be that the mother's fear induced an outpouring of adrenaline into her bloodstream, which then affected the fetus. But I did not need the cooperation of her mother's story to strengthen my conviction that the patient had relived her conception. The way in which the analysis had moved inexorably in this direction added to the framework of my own understanding, which had been extending steadily over the previous 4 years, and left me no doubt that this is what had happened. I was exceedingly fortunate that this work took place with a patient whose personality was fundamentally very sound. I was also fortunate that the interval between the first occasion of encountering a regression to earlier than the 5th month of fetal life and this patient's regression to her conception was very short. It was just possible to postulate that even at the 5th month, the brain and nervous system were sufficiently developed to have carried out the mental activity of which I believed I had evidence. But a long drawn out series of patient regression, but a long drawn out series of patients regressioning successively to periods earlier than this would have been intellectually disquieting, for I was then still imbued with the idea that no part of an individual existed before his conception, and that there could not possibly be, I seem to have the hiccups. Oh dear. There could not possibly be any form of mental function without a more or less fully developed brain. As it was, I was confronted with a series of regressions which bridged the period before birth to conception in these sessions, these 3 sessions. Clinically and intuitively, I had accepted their validity, which was surely justified by the results. But before I had had time to speculate on how they could have been possible, the answer had arrived in my head. In a human being, there must be an element which exists and is capable of function even in the absence of a physical body. The concept of such a non-physical component, under one name or another, must be as old as mankind, but it was tremendously exciting to have reached it for myself through a series of experiences which had been acceptable to me, to my intellect. I felt as though I had arrived at a clearing in a forest from which paths could be seen to run in a variety of directions, promising to lead towards the answers to such questions as the relationship of mind to body, the nature of memory, and so on. But, not surprisingly, a new question now presented itself. What is the origin of this component? It might be imagined that reincarnation dropped neatly into place in an entirely acceptable answer, but in fact, this was not the case. There were, I think, several reasons. Probably the most telling was my assumption that since the body was initiated by a contribution from each parent, the psyche, as I then called the non physical component, would be formed in a similar way. This error caused me to misinterpret my patient's reliving of her conception to the extent that I assumed she was reliving the meeting of the sperm and the ovum instead of, as I now believe was the case, the moment when her personality contacted the fertilized egg. I had, in fact, a mental picture of half psyches bestriding the germ cells like jockeys. However, artificial insemination made this difficult to sustain. I could not imagine several million half psyches, each perched precariously on a sperm, waiting in a bottle in a refrigerator until some operator gave them the okay. On the other hand, I could not see a really acceptable alternative. It was undeniable that children inherited physical characteristics from their parents, and I still assumed mistakenly that certain traits of personality for which the body could not be held responsible were also inherited. The idea of a long personal history was obscured from me by Jung's concept of the universal unconsciousness. The universal unconscious, which seemed so adequately to explain such phenomena as man who had lived all his life in the depth of the country dreaming about the sea. I'm going to read that sentence again because it seems important. The idea of a long personal history was obscured for me by Jung's concept of the universal unconscious, which seemed so adequately to explain such phenomena as a man who had lived all his life in the depths of the country dreaming about the sea. During the next 6 years, I encountered patients His anxiety I still found myself unable to explain, even after the most exhaustive scrutiny of their life story in terms of classified psychoanalytic theory. Such cases caused me to wonder whether it was possible for an individual to inherit anxiety from a parent. But it did not come to me, no, but it did not cause me to think in terms of earlier lifetimes of his own. Such cases caused me to wonder whether it was possible for an individual to inherit anxiety from a parent, but it did not cause me to think in terms of earlier lifetimes of his own. Thus, although my thoughts returned time and again to the question of where the psyche had come from, the rigidity of my own thinking prevented me from making any satisfactory progress. Then, one evening early in 1958, I was talking with a chance acquaintance, an aeronautical scientist, about extrasensory perception, ESP. I had described to him an occasion where a patient who was deeply under hypnosis had apparently been able to project her mind to my house and to describe certain features of it with remarkable accuracy. Her first comment had been that there seemed to be a double hedge around it. In fact, the garden was enclosed by a hedge, inside which was a fence I had erected because the hedge was not thick enough to contain my boxer bitch. She then said, "There is a lawn in front of the house, and there are several small trees on it." This was quite accurate. I had recently planted some apple trees on the lawn, which was about the size of a lawn tennis court. Her next remark was upsetting. No, her next remark was surprising. Not upsetting, surprising. "It is dark, and I cannot find my way into the house." I had overlooked the fact that this session was taking place late on a winter evening. Furthermore, the front door was recessed and set at an unusual angle. Several visitors had found it difficult to locate at night if the light above it had not been switched on. I had been impressed by this small experiment, but my acquaintance accepted it calmly, merely observing that he believed that there had been eras when a great deal more had been known about such forms of perception than was the case today. He went on to tell me that the faculty my patient had displayed had been used in early dynastic Egypt, as we now use radar. He then asked me if I had read any books by Joan Grant. I replied that I had never heard of them, whereupon he told me that this author had the faculty for being able to recall many of her earlier lives, and that 7 of her books were in fact posthumous autobiographies. Such a faculty was far beyond the point to which my own work had brought me, but I felt a sense of excitement, a sense that a door was about to open upon far more than merely the answer to a philosophical problem. Before I had finished Winged Pharaoh, the book I tried first, I knew beyond any possibility of doubt that reincarnation was a reality. It would be futile to try to account for this feeling of certainty in terms of pure reason. Only later did intellect bridge the gap between my own researches and intuitive conviction that I had been reminded of a fundamental pattern of evolution which I had long known to be true. I would have journeyed halfway around the world to meet the author, but fortunately, such a long pilgrimage proved unnecessary. I soon learned that Joan was living only 30 miles away. I met her on the 14th of May. I came to dinner and left at 3 o'clock in the morning. Seldom can so many words have been exchanged in 8 hours. As I had anticipated, my experience with hypnosis, linked with Joan's knowledge and experience of reincarnation, is effortlessly as a river meets the sea. But as the autobiography of her present life covers only the period up to 1937, I did not know that during the war years she had worked closely with a psychiatrist and had acquired considerable psychiatric experience. This was an entirely unexpected bonus. It seemed to be absurd that the fullest possible use should not have been made of her faculties while she wished for nothing more than the opportunity to resume regular work in the field. So before I left, we had already discussed tentative plans for working together. We, neither of us, foresaw that within 2 months we should have embarked on life together also. Well, that was a marvelous chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. And yeah, so yeah, till soon.